Welcome back. I'm Steve Clemens, editor-at-large of The Hill. Welcome back for the second session of our Big Future of Jobs Summit. I'd like to thank our sponsor, Nokia, for making this timely event possible. In our first session, we discussed the pandemic's ongoing impact on the workforce and lessons we've learned. Over the next hour, we're going to examine how the landscape of work is changing and what transitions are likely to become permanent. The role of technology is critical to any discussion of the future. In addition, we're going to zoom in on the increased importance of upskilling, pardon the pun, the value of investing in employees of all ages, and a diverse array of solutions to bring back the workforce, jobs, and the economy. We're going to have an incredible lineup of speakers joining us shortly. But before we get underway, a few housekeeping notes. Tweet us at @TheHillEvents using the hashtag #TheHillJobs. We're broadcasting live and we'll take your questions throughout the program. And if you experience any trouble with the live stream, please refresh the page. I think that'll be a quick fix. Our first guest is a co-chair of the New Democrat Coalition's Future of Work Task Force and represents the 11th District of the great state of Michigan. Congresswoman Haley Stevenson, it's great to see you again. Tell us about the task force and what are the highest, I guess the most important elements as you look forward. I mean, I kind of been joking through this day that we're not just talking about the future of jobs, we're talking about jobs of the future. And, how do we marry those? So, I know you've worked on this not only in Congress, but in the Obama administration previously. So tell us what you think the most important thing in your task force is.
Well, and not only have I worked on this in government, Steve, but I've also worked on this in the private sector. And the reality is, and many know this, is that the jobs are here and that we've got advanced technology, advanced manufacturing jobs ready for people who have that expertise or that interest. And frankly, sometimes people don't even know that these are career pathways that might be available to them, particularly at a manufacturing shop floor that maybe isn't a household name, but is producing critical medical supplies or critical parts components for the automotive sector. And so really, this is a catalytic moment for us right now in the United States. And as part of why last month, alongside our majority whip, Jim Clyburn, we launched a working group on manufacturing to ensure that we are ushering in the best legislation focused on our manufacturing economy, focused on these jobs, as you call them, the jobs of the future that are here today, that are ripe for the taking, that are, the ones and zeros that are digitizing our entire manufacturing sector and industries of incredible scale and economies of scale that must be afforded equally and equitably to all Americans. And so that's a big part of what we're focusing on, just as we're looking to tackle the large challenge of climate change and certainly the ushering in of electric vehicles that are being set as targets by our industry partners and also our federal government.
Representative Stevens, that's a very provocative and important way to frame it. And nobody else has quite framed that way. The jobs are here. And we know they're here because we can measure them and we know what the gap is with unfilled positions that are out there. Tonight, President Biden is going to be giving a speech to you and to many of your other colleagues in a joint session of Congress. And they're going to talk about infrastructure. They're going to talk about transportation, mobility, lots of things coming down the pike and the millions of jobs that will be created. Is that the wrong focus? Should we be focused on, instead of, okay, we're going to create new jobs, that it really is about the partnerships to get people trained and credentialed, in a more nimble space to get the jobs that we already have, in addition to ones the Biden, as I always hear about job creation, I don't hear how you just framed it, that maybe we're worrying about the wrong part of the equation.
Well, look, we've certainly all lived through the future today, right? Particularly in the last 15 years with the arrival of the gig economy and the mobility economy that's also rapidly transformed. And so I think we all have these, notions of, well, oh my gosh, if we usher in large scale automation and we have autonomous vehicles, are we going to lose all the truck driving jobs? And then all of a sudden everyone's talking about the truck driving jobs that we're going to lose, and they're not talking about the open truck driving jobs that we have available right now that need to get filled.
Which is huge. It's a huge number.
It's a huge number. And that's right. That's not even in light industrial. I mean, I'm every week going in and sitting down with manufacturers in my district and the small ones, and they all have job openings. And so what I want to see us do is do a recruitment effort similar to what the Army does, right? We want you and we want to incentivize you. And frankly, our country's national security depends on this. This workforce shortage that we have, coupled with the reality that the census data just showed us that we've got the lowest level of population growth since the 1930s, right? That this is a national security imperative, that we need people working in these manufacturing jobs so we can produce these goods and not have these supply chain disruptions that we just lived through in 2020, but also so that we can have profit and growing and strong regional economies all over this country.
You know, you were chief of staff for the U.S. Auto Rescue Task Force. And at that time, you know, the auto industry, in case people, you'd look at a car today, or you look at an airplane, you look at anything that we manufacture, and there are lots of pieces of that manufactured all over the world. So you always have, you know, try to have trusted, you know, supply chains, both domestically and globally. You know, as we look at industry today, you know, you're sitting in Michigan, and there's been a lot of discussion about reshoring, about bringing investment and manufacturing capacity back into America. Are we prepared for that? And are you worried at all that we're getting the framing wrong? That is going to be a, I don't know, an illusion?
Sure. Well, what you're talking about is that supply chains are complex and that they're global, and that you don't sit down with any manufacturer who isn't an exporter or, by and large, who isn't an exporter or involved in international production of their product. What we want to identify and what we need to do, and you can look at the electric car batteries, a great example of an exercise that we've got to undertake as a federal government in partnership with private industry, which is we've got to look at the supply chain holistically. What are we making here? What are we not making here? For instance, electrolytes. It's a chemical that goes into the lithium ion battery. I've got one in Michigan that does this and another one in Tennessee. It's astonishing, right? And the chemicals all come from China. So when we identify and we get access to the data and the information, then we can look at a suite of policy solutions, right? One has got to be diversification of existing manufacturers here in the United States. Second one, you talk about reshoring. Yeah, there's obviously some great opportunities with that. We saw this in Detroit 10 years ago when our real estate prices were really low here, that companies, instead of moving overseas, were moving to Detroit. And I know a lot of them who did that. And it's a great thing. But we need to have an attraction strategy for foreign direct investment as well that can tie into diversification. And you'll see this, right, with some of these trade agreements that we've, just recently participated in, obviously the big one being USMCA. There is a plussed up Buy American content requirement that also affords us a great opportunity to do that diversification, to do that harnessing, and also, Steve, go to where they're innovating, right? And cooking out basic research and new technologies, sometimes originally bought by our federal government, but sometimes also sitting in the universities that can be commercialized. Not everything's a win, but you look at our Stanford guys who made Google, 20 years ago. These are the types of things that are happening in a place I call home in Michigan, where I had laid off engineers, 10 years ago who invented new products in their basements that are now small businesses right here in southeastern Michigan.
Wow. Haley, we've got to go in a second, but there's a good question that's come in from Philip Iannuzzi I'd love to ask you. He's from the Workforce Development Leader for Learning and Development at Boeing. And he says, how can we use technology to respond to the compressed half-life of learning in the workplace? That is the need to learn, unlearn, and relearn new skills and competencies at a fast rate? I love this question. But I think with regards to the task force, the new Democratic coalition on task force on jobs, that's, I think, a very important component of what you folks are struggling with.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, Steve, I actually was working with Boeing in the private sector on this exact thing, which is, the rapid transformations in digitizing our manufacturing base and the need to have engineers who understood those integrated systems, who got the time to get that on-the-job learning. Bigger companies like Boeing are really well positioned, and yet they're still asking that question. our smaller manufacturers, and this is right, their clients are a lot of times the big OEs. They're struggling with just even the basics of Wi-Fi modernization, let alone taking their 30, 60 person workforce off the what they're working on the line to get that additional job training. And so what we have found is on the job credentialing, which is successful, but also online learning through platforms like Coursera, where I actually created the country's first online job training program in digital manufacturing in partnership with Lockheed Martin and the University at Buffalo. So part of this is meeting people where they are and also letting them know that you are going to be a lifelong learner as a working professional, that you don't just springboard out of a degree program and then you're set and good to go. And we've also got to support the businesses so they've got the opportunity to do that on the job training. That is truly, Steve, the money question. This is something that our task force is going to take on in terms of backing up the small businesses of America so they have the resources and the support to do this.
You know, I love talking to you and, you know, thinking about all the arenas that we can constructively disrupt: education, credentialing, training, a lot of these areas, and kind of, you know, get folks into these right positions that have the jobs that are here. Representative Haley Stevens, Democrat of Michigan, co-chair of the New Democrats Coalition Task Force on Jobs. Thank you so much for joining us today. Joining me now is Johnny C. Taylor Jr., President and Chief Executive Officer of SHRM, the Society for Human Resource Management, the largest HR association in the world. As a member of the White House American Workforce Policy Advisory Board and chair of the President's Advisory Board on historically black colleges and universities, Johnny Taylor is a sought-after voice on all matters affecting work. Thanks so much for joining us, Johnny. You know, this is called the Future of Jobs Summit, but it could equally be called Jobs of the Future Summit. And as you sort of think about the tension between our incumbent workforce and where we need to go, I know that HR, that job training, that the social contract between companies and their employees is a key part. I'd love to understand from you how we need to think about orienting how we get to those jobs of the future.
Well, so a couple of issues, and thank you for having me here. The first is, this is going to be a long slog, and it's going to be made worse by the pandemic, the loss of learning. So in some ways, we have an upskilling conversation, which I want to have, that really focuses on current employees whose jobs have changed or will change significantly over the next 5 years, such that they are not going to be useful if they are not upskilled and reskilled. But we also have a future workforce problem. Think about it. For the last year, in some cases as much as a year and a half, K through 12 schooling, as we know it, traditionally has not been occurring. And so what we're going to have is a real problem 5, 7, 10 years from now, when those children now become our future workers and they won't have known even the basics. Forget upskilling into a job. We're going to have some basic reading, writing, and arithmetic problems. So this is where we finally have come to the realization that it's not just the employee's responsibility, it is the employer's responsibility. It's a joint responsibility to ensure that we have a sufficient, highly qualified and well-trained workforce of the future.
So you have written and commented, I love your Twitter feed, you've talked a lot that we can't afford to leave talent on the table, that we can't afford to exclude folks from the workforce, that the demands for talent are so high. You know, what are some of the practices that SHRM puts in place so that employers can reach people where they are, and as you just said, bring them along, because we have some basic education problems out in the country and we need to upskill, but you know, sometimes squaring all these circles, if that's a term, is hard to do.
Well, so one is companies, more and more employers are realizing they have an obligation to build bridges to the K through 12 system. We've got to ensure that this future workforce is not only ready to do what we need them to do, but have the right mindset about coming into a knowledge-based economy that really values innovation and also teamwork and those sorts of life-ready skills, right? So one, employers are reaching back much earlier in the process, and not just interviewing at college campuses, but going all the way into middle and high schools to get students prepared. When you think about the workforce as we think about it, like and people don't think about this perfect storm, right? You've got a hot economy, The American birth rate has been on a decline since the year 2000. We've had fewer and fewer babies. And I jokingly say, while millennials we need them to have children, they're having pets, right? And we need babies. So the reality is, if every American had a kid today who was capable of having children today, we wouldn't be able to solve for our talent needs for another 18 to 20 years, because they have to grow up and be educated and then come into the workforce. So what we've got to do is focus very much on three groups in particular within this world of untapped pool of talent. First of all, the formerly incarcerated. This is not a feel-good thing. We have an obligation to figure out how to cast our nets a little more widely. And it includes people who may have had brushes with the law, and even in some instances served time in a correctional facility, but we can't just write them off. That's 700,000 people per year who are going to come out of the country's prisons and jails every year. And that's a source for us. Okay, number one. Number two, older workers. We have written off people. Once you turn 45, the world says you're old, and everyone wants these young kids to come into the workforce, realizing, one, there are fewer of them, but secondly, they don't have the experience that comes with waking up every day. So we've got to cast, once again, instead of just running, think about the coding academies. They're all focused on young people. Why not go to the 45-year-old and say, we're going to teach you how to code, because you can be in the workforce and are likely to be in the workforce for at least another 15, 20 years. That's another area. And then finally, an area that we've got to be far more cognizant about is veterans. Like, we are every year bringing people who've served our country back out of active duty service into the workplace, and we're saying your skills don't match, so we're not hiring them. So those are three areas that I think, if we are very intentional about recruiting from untapped pools of talent, we can help solve for the country's coming and growing war for talent.
That's very informative. We have Jim McKelvey on later in the program, who helped launch Code, whose one of the explicit purposes was to take middle-aged workers, people who had had a rough time in their life, and turn them into world-class coders that are not just, the younger crowd. So I'm really happy to hear you dovetailing with that. Johnny, you're a member of the White House American Workforce Policy Advisory Board. What are some of the big truths that you've helped the White House understand about how to be better when it comes to working with workforce issues?
Well, the one is that you mentioned right from the beginning, that, heretofore and in times past, what we've really thought about upskilling was the employee's problem. It's portable. So me getting you graduate education or getting you new skills doesn't benefit me, it benefits you. And what we've had to do and spend a lot of time with the former administration emphasizing, and employers were there, Jenny Rometty at IBM, Tim Cook from Apple, we were all sitting around the table, the 25 of us, saying, this is a joint accountability. It's not enough to leave it up to employees to retool themselves. We have got to invest time, money, energy into ensuring that we help bridge that gap, because ultimately, in a knowledge-based economy, if we don't have enough people to do our jobs, then it limits our competitiveness long time. Globally, for this country in particular, we can't compete. Think about it. The biggest populations of people are sitting in China and India. If America is going to compete, we've got to figure out how to make sure that we have a robust, highly qualified talent workforce. The other thing that we talked a lot about in the Workforce Policy Advisory Board was this conversation around enlarging the pool of candidates. And so traditionally we've gone out and we look for people who have college degrees. It's a proxy for smart. And we really challenged the notion as an advisory board to the White House to say, do all of these jobs need formal education? Do all of them need, or even, should we even say, many of them don't even, it's not even a preference. So they've gone from bachelor's degree required to bachelor's degree preferred. And we've said the answer might be, don't mention a bachelor's degree at all, because that job doesn't require it. That was a big lesson that we shared and came up with an innovation, I think, in some ways, during the work of the White House Policy Advisory Board, Workforce Policy Advisory Board.
Well, Johnny Taylor, President and CEO of SHRM, the Society for Human Resource Management. I could talk to you all day about credentialing. I could talk to you all day about building empathy in this country. You've talked about our need to walk in each other's shoes and to think about each other more. Really appreciate the contributions you make on this front. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, my friend. Enjoyed it.
And now it's time for the sponsor perspective portion of our program. Before we get going, a quick clarification. While I'm conducting the interview and these questions are mine, the content of this portion of the event shouldn't be considered editorial. With that, I'd like to welcome Brian Hendricks, Vice President of Policy and Government Relations at Nokia Americas, or Yoda. By other names. Brian, it's great to see you. So in the spirit of Yoda, tell us what the future looks like a little bit. I think today, I don't know if you heard my conversation with Zoe Baird, President of the Markle Foundation, but I gave her credit 20 years ago for saying, broadband and the internet is going to come along and transform our lives. How is 5G? Is our connectivity going to potentially, I know it's going to change everything, but what are some of the big things that you see coming down the pike that would be good to conceptualize for our audience?
Well, first, thanks, Steve, for having us again, and congratulations on another great program on an under-discussed issue of great import. I think if you take a look moving backwards, the concept of automation in the workforce isn't particularly new. It dates back to even before, but certainly to the time of the first computers coming online and robots in manufacturing. But it's accelerating. And it's accelerating because we now have intelligent devices. We now have a burgeoning field of artificial intelligence and machine learning, big data science and analytics to drive decision making. And you note 5G. Which unfortunately and fortunately is an accelerant in digitalization of big sectors of the economy. We talked about this, I think, on a prior appearance. We're going to be looking in manufacturing and what we call as one of our target verticals, intelligent manufacturing, at a completely different orientation of the shop floor of the future, one that moves away from the idea of large machines, single purpose factories, tethered to outlets and big bulky cabling, to lean multi-purpose machines with batteries, all networked wirelessly to a tablet and an operations manager who can reorient the factory multiple times during the day for different production runs for different customers. And that's interesting. That has enormous value in terms of productivity, but it's going to fundamentally shift the nature of skills that are necessary to be employed in manufacturing. You can still be a machinist to keep the machines in operation, but you're going to need upskilling, as your past guests have talked about, to make sure that you're proficient in battery systems and communications capabilities to keep those machines online. We're seeing applications in what we call precision farming, where you're going to have equipment on the farm that is going to be fully sensored and networked for operations, big data sets driving decision making on when to add nutrients to the soil, when to harvest, when to irrigate. So we're talking about digitalization of sectors, much more being driven by machines with intelligence. That's going to dislocate some workers, and some workers are going to have massive retooling that's necessary. Some, like the machinist that I described, might be able to be retooled with more limited training. But as you go across the sectors, we look at the way that you're seeing delivery of groceries. There's a wonderful company called Nuru that's way down the road for autonomously driven small vehicles to deliver your grocery order. So it's not just being able to shop and order online and do curbside pickup. You're going to actually have the ability for a self-driven automobile to show up and deliver your package. So this is going to dislocate workers in the logistics fields as well. And so it begs the question, how do we retrofit the skills? The good news is that which giveth can or taketh away may be able to giveth, as a turn on the old saying. And that is that 5G brings with it tremendous new capabilities that we didn't have in terms of the capacity of the network and the low latency. So we're going to be able to do things, not just self-directed video learning, but we're going to be able to do things like augmented reality, virtual reality for simulation-based training. Eventually, as we reach the target speeds of 20 gigabit per second data rates in the network, you can start talking about haptic feedback, real-time feedback to a device that you're using that might be able to help train a surgical tech or a dental hygienist. So there are tremendous opportunities to use the technology. But as I said in the promo for this event, connectivity is the coin of the realm. If you're not connected, it's going to be very difficult for you to have access to these new types of educational training, even if, and we can talk about this, even if we change the credentialing, we change the mindset, we change the way that people access education from just universities and trade schools, which can be expensive or geographically inconvenient. Even if we are able to change the education model, if people don't have connectivity, it's going to be extremely difficult for them to upskill.
Brian, I told my audience you are the guy who sees the future. It's very clearly the case. I'm getting one more quick question and a quick cosmic question. How do I frame this? My friend Jim McKelvey, who co-founded Square, is going to be joining us at the end of the program today. And Jim has a book that I'm obsessed with right now called The Innovation Stack. And it's essentially not just about an entrepreneur coming up with a great idea. It's about all of the steps that are taken to create a virtuous circle, to survive, to win, to thrive as a firm. And, as I think about this question we're struggling with, and, you and I did not coordinate, I'm just sort of interested in how you see it. Cities are almost sentient. Big firms have to get themselves. Government has to begin thinking about it. And we as individuals in all of this need to know how to position ourselves in a way and equip us for this future that's coming. But when cities are going to be trying to fix problems they have, like Jim McKelvey describes in the Innovation Stack, how do you see technology in this next set of platforms becoming the itch that everyone has to scratch to survive and fix our social problems?
Well, first, let me say that technology is a very divisive issue. If you looked, for example, at the Pew Research that was done, I think in May of 2017, 2018, on the future of jobs, they did a lot of surveys about people's attitudes, and about 90% of respondents said, I acknowledge that technology is ultimately going to drive automation and job dislocation, but the confidence that people had in the ability of government, private industry, and others to respond in a non-fragmented way, to reorient the training that would be available to them, the confidence dropped all the way from that 90 down into the 60s. And the polling that we've actually done and seen others do about attitudes towards technology are really important to understand, because every one of us knows somebody who has been dislocated by automation. But the attitudes towards technology, the distrust and the fear of technology that is expressed in the electorate, and not just because of partisan issues like content platform moderation, but because of this automation issue, as long as distrust and fear of technology persists, our ability to respond and ask people to trust in technology to be able to retrofit their skills is going to be a challenge itself. So I think part of it has to be about attitudes towards technology and how we talk about it. The other thing is, there's no polite way to say this. We suck at responding to the need for education and reskilling. It's not a new phenomenon, but we still far too many instances where the furniture plant closes and the wood turner is out of a job. We respond with economic adjustment assistance, and he spends 9 months looking for another wood turning job. And when he doesn't find one, he becomes discouraged and he becomes structurally unemployable and he drops out of the labor force. We just need, and there are good responses. You've heard about some of them from your guests here today, but they're happening in a very fragmented, siloed approach. Right. So we have to figure out what's the catalyst to bring those together, to up people's confidence in the ability of technology to help. And then we have to ultimately develop and reorient attitudes towards training and skilling and credentialing, and also employers being willing to accept new types of credentialing and skilling. And then that can be transformative. But that's a lot of things that have to happen on the back end. We've invented the technology. The rest has to be the focus of other programs and activities.
Brian, I think we ought to have a podcast. We should have a podcast together. So Brian Hendricks, Vice President, Policy and Government Relations for Nokia. Really appreciate you supporting these conversations, but also for having a real conversation with me about what all this means. Thank you so much for today. And as always, thank you for joining us.
Oh, thanks again, Steve.
In a study conducted last year at Workable, it was found that since the outbreak of the pandemic, 42% of companies stepped up their upskilling and reskilling efforts, and that 42% of employees pursue training on their own. Those are big numbers, and they are heartening. To discuss the landscape of upskilling, Taylor Jr., President and Continuing Education, we're joined by an all-star lineup of experts. Andy Van Clunen is the CEO of the National Skills Coalition, an organization that advocates for inclusive, high-quality skills training. He is way cool. Plinio Ayala is CEO and President of Per Skolas, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, an organization that trains workers workers for in-demand technical roles, get on their Twitter feed. They do really great stuff, and they are great communicators. Angie Kamath is the Dean for Continuing Education at Workforce Development at the City University of New York. And Nancy Lamond is Executive Vice President, Chief Advocacy and Engagement Officer at AARP. It's great to have all of you here. I think this will just make this kind of like the View format. Any of you can jump in and finish each other's sentences, on this. But Andy, let me start with you. I mean, you just go right to them. You kind of go right after, Andrew Sorkin and CNBC and Squawk Box and say, look, in your coverage of the Biden plan, why don't you, listen to Mark Zandi and go out there and try to figure out how to get the many hundreds of thousands of laid off workers in the restaurant industry retrained for jobs in the infrastructure area. This goes right to what I was discussing with Brian Hendricks a moment ago, which is why aren't we more nimble? Or maybe we are and I don't know it, but what is impeding our ability to create credentialing, training, partnerships, and just kind of begin moving talent in the right places in this nation in a way that doesn't feel like such a lift?
Mm-hmm. It's a great question, Steve. I actually think that we as a country, in local industries, in colleges like Angie's, and the work that Plinio is doing, we actually know a lot about this. Our challenge is that we don't have public policies that want to scale this. So, we want employers to be at the table when we think about what kind of retraining we want, but we don't invest in.
So I just want to interrupt you there for a minute, Andy, because you said something important. You said we don't have public policies that want to scale this. I just want to underline that for a moment. That's a big statement. So please go further. I just wanted to emphasize I heard that. I want everybody else here. It's a big statement.
Yeah, there's been a lot of talk currently about kind of where we as a country rank in our physical infrastructure investments relative to the rest of the world. And we're pretty low on this scale, but we're even lower on the scale in terms of active labor market policies, not just how do we invest in people's training to get them their first job. And we have millions of people that we need to kind of get into a job who are currently unemployed or marginally employed because of the pandemic. But we have tens of millions of folks who are at risk of losing their job because of all the things that you've talked about over the past 2 hours. Technology changing workplaces, transforming industries, and we don't have a strategy to actually train the tens of millions of folks who are currently in the workforce to figure out how to keep their skills ahead of the technological curve. And so it's both an employment challenge, but it's also an upskilling and advancement challenge, and we just don't have the policy apparatus there to do it. I will say, with the recent proposals from the Biden administration, both the jobs plan that we got a little while ago and the families plan that we got today, we may be finally turning the corner on this. And we're very excited about what some of the potential is for some of those proposals. We just want to make sure that they're bringing industry to the table to figure out how to use these dollars on the ground, and that we're making them as flexible as possible, not just for new workers who are entering our industry for the first time, but for folks who are currently employed and holding on a full-time job.
Thank you. Angie and Plinio, I'm going to get to Nancy in a second, but she'll be my backup hitter here. But Angie and Plinio, when I think about some of the things we've been discussing today and why isn't the U.S. economy somehow more efficient in these areas, what needs to be done? A lot of it, Angie, is, some non-scientific, is stigma about education, stigma about someone's life experience, and so human resource departments don't want to take risks. Stigma against, oddly enough, lifelong learning and lifelong education. I know you're all working on it, but I'd like to know from your perspective, at one of the great institutions of learning in New York, what are the blocks that we can remove to make this flow better?
Sure, thanks so much, Steve. There's a couple of things that I think are incredibly important. And I would also like to underscore what Andy said in terms of just policies that really need to enable scaling up of upskilling programs. I think employers don't necessarily care about continuing ed versus associate degrees or graduate degrees or bachelor's degrees. I think we in the education system are very fixated on that. I think employers want really great, competent folks that have competencies that they need, folks that have an ability to learn new competencies, folks that have an ability to really have digital skills, whether those digital skills are in data or in software development or in cybersecurity. I think some of the blocks that we have really are around employer partnerships. I think a lot of employers just have a very traditional way of recruiting talent. You get through an internship in your senior or junior year that then converts to a full-time job. And if you're not in that pipeline, you're kind of shut out of that labor market. And that's not a very competency-driven hiring plan. It's not a very inclusive hiring pathway. It's not a very good pathway for kind of making sure that the skills are available. And so I think some of the blocks are just making sure that we've got some really great commitments from employers to work hand in hand with the academy, not just for short-term silver bullet training, but for long-term training, for degree programs. We've had some exceptional work over the past year with the New York Jobs CEO Council, a tremendous partnership with 28 firms, of the largest firms in New York City, who have really pledged to make hiring commitments to create micro-credentials that advantage students who go through and complete competency-based credentialing to be advantaged in the hiring and interview process. And those are the types of system changes that I think we'd like to see more of. And so I think, Steve, some of those are, blocks and perception issues, I think, of employers, of consumers, of students. And I think that the idea of really making sure that we've got an ability to partner industry with educational providers is incredibly important. And a real commitment to hiring and making sure that the curriculum, whether it's short-term, long-term degree, is really career connected. Those are some of the pieces that I think come to mind.
Thank you. I mean, we're going to get to Nancy in a minute, but I mean, the ageism, the other forms of discrimination that are against the hiring. I mean, there's so many people just operating from inertia in this business. I sort of found that we need to shake that up a little bit. But anyway, you are shaking it up. And I just sort of feel like maybe we, particularly in the tech area, we just ought to subcontract you to fix all this, because you're training people in tech training for free. Now, I don't know how you're doing that, but tell us what you are doing. And can you train some of Nancy Lamont's people, because they're very interested. We're going to get to that in a second.
First of all, thank you for including me this afternoon. Just to add a bit about what Angie talked about, certainly there is this need, I think, for this nation to redefine post-secondary education. I think we often pigeonhole our young people or our adults that college is the only answer, and there are organizations like Perscolis that can provide these short-term interventions that can move people into these amazing IT jobs that lead to incredible IT careers. And I think as a nation, we need to embrace that. And employers, I believe, at this point in time, are beginning to do that. I think Representative Stevens talked about the jobs that are in demand now, that exist now, that are going unfilled. I think it's a business imperative for employers to think differently about hiring, to look at pipelines of talent that organizations like Perscolis can build for them as a viable solution to some of the jobs that are going unfilled right now. I think that mindset is beginning to change. And I think as a nation, we need to take advantage of that to scale what works. I think to underscore what Andy began us with, this idea that this nation is beginning to think about investing in workforce development in a very large way. We're very excited about what the Biden administration is proposing. My suggestion is that we really think about how we do that strategically and intelligently, right? How do we invest in models that are effective, models that work, that have proven outcomes? If we're going to all invest in, let's say, energy stocks, we'd find 2 or 3 companies that we want to invest in that would realize a good return for us, and that's where we put our money. We wouldn't put it in companies that we would perhaps lose our investments. And so I think public dollars should be invested the same way. When you look at an organization like Perscolis, who's gone through 2 random control trials, the most recent one indicated that the return on the investment is huge. For every dollar invested in Perscolis, you get $8 back, 800% return. That's an amazing return in anyone's book.
Right.
There are a lot of models like Perscolis out there that work. Yeah. We just need to invest in those that are most effective.
I really love it. I want to come back to you, all in a moment, kind of tell us about, life stories you've changed. But I want to jump to Nancy Lamont. And Nancy, I don't know if you did this on purpose, but I got an email. When I get an email from Nancy, I get this little alert, and it pops up on my screen while I was doing this show. And so I kind of, while I was sneaking and saying, oh God, what did Nancy send to me? And it was basically about entrepreneurs in the 50 plus area, about incumbent workforce, and about she gave a talk, which I quietly, lip read what you were saying at the New York Federal Reserve Board, with regards to, some of our elder American citizens and the talents there, and how, we kind of underestimate. I mean, I actually once, I'll shut up in a minute. I actually, interviewed Nancy once, and she said, look, I am in the American AARP, but the future of retirement is work. It's the greatest line I've heard. So, Nancy, I'd love to, as we kind of think about these questions of our workforce, and oftentimes there is an age bias in this of looking, as Angie just said, at the people. But if you look at most of our university today, the reality is we have non-traditional students dominating in a lot of these schools and universities, and they continue to be engaged, relevant, and innovative. And so tell us what we need to know about this frame, and then we're going to have our three other panelists come in and respond to you.
Sure. Well, you make a terrific point. Talk about a perception issue. I think, though we all kind of know better, people tend to think you reach the age of 60, 65, and you leave the workforce, and you are either playing golf, sitting on your porch, having an all-day book group. I don't know what the view is, but the fact is, for the last 20 years, there's been a steady increase in the number of older Americans in the workforce. There's also, as you point out, a steady increase of entrepreneurs over the age of 55. You referred to a program we did with the Federal Reserve in New York, where we looked at the impact of COVID on that group. Devastating. And they were largely older entrepreneurs. Another point I'd love to make is that, we all think the gig economy was invented for millennials, and that it's a world of T-shirts and skinny jeans. But the reality is, pre-COVID, a third of the so-called gig workforce were older workers. And so you see this pattern. And of course, people are living longer. They want to stay engaged longer. And also they have to, and this is an important point, 50%, half of people turning the age of 50 have virtually no retirement savings. So what that tells you is that older workers are here to stay. Similarly, another kind of myth is that older workers aren't interested in or won't deal with technology. And again, that's not true. We are not digital natives, obviously, but many of us use technology in our jobs. And importantly, COVID showed us, if not in the job world, then certainly in the world of your quality of life, you need to know how to go online. Anybody who wanted to get a vaccine had a 90% greater chance of getting it if they could go online than if they went to a 1-800 number, which, by the way, told you to go online after you talked to them. These are all things that are absolutely evident, along with an issue we don't talk about very much, and that's age discrimination. And we have countless studies that show that a vast number of people over the age of 50 believe there is age discrimination in the workforce. There's evidence in terms of cases with the EEOC. I think one of you mentioned the way companies hire, and many of them use devices on your resume to see how old you are, track things like that. We're going to have to deal with this, because to be a strong economy, as I think all of you mentioned, and as Brian underscored, we're going to need the full force of older workers.
Yeah, well, I've mentioned it all the time. Andy, I really appreciate that perspective, and I would love to tell people you can see Nancy in this very interesting forum, very serious forum of the New York Federal Reserve Board on entrepreneurs, on the 50-plus community. It's very, very interesting, done at the end of March. But Andy, let me come back to all of you, but Andy first. Years ago when I worked in the United States Senate in the 1990s for Jeff Bingaman, think of Roswell, New Mexico. Roswell was famous for more things than Area 51, but it had a big bus making factory. We made big buses. They had a Levi's factory there. These two plants shut down, and the assessment was made that trade had impacted them. So through trade adjustment assistance, we supposedly gave retraining to these people. And the truth is, in the 1990s, we were crappy at it. We didn't retrain anyone. It was a fig leaf over impacts in people's lives. Have we gotten better at training, in the last 25 years? Do we have greater ability? Does Per Scholas, does the National Skills, Coalition, are we able to take those people that are incumbent workers and begin moving them in real ways as opposed to fake ways, like we used to promise in the past but never delivered?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think that we know how to train folks for local industry if local industry is involved in figuring out what the training should be. Full stop. And I think if we have policies that enable that and support that and bring employers and unions and colleges and community organizations and others together to kind of figure out that strategy, we have excellent outcomes from that kind of training. I think the point that you make around laid off manufacturing workers and things that I think we have not done yet, but again, props to the Biden administration, both in the proposals around rethinking dislocated worker policy that was proposed under the jobs plan and indexing UI reform, unemployment insurance reform that was talked about in the families plan released today, is that we need to kind of see training as part of a package of things that we're doing, which include income support and healthcare support and other kinds of support services, and to give folks enough time to make a pretty significant transition in their lives. If they've been working in the same industry, in the same occupation for 30 years, you just don't turn on a dime with that. And we should be doing that whether you've been displaced because of trade or technology or a pandemic or even a downturn in the business cycle. And it's time that we kind of get past this categorical differentiation about why you lost your job and fully investing in how it is we're going to get you back into some kind of work and to keep you whole while you're doing that.
Per, I would love to get your thoughts on the training piece of this and whether or not you think we've gotten past that moment where we can now push reset and we actually can, as Andy said, make greater inroads in this.
Yes, I think we
Please.
can. I think we've learned that getting employers involved at the very beginning in designing these models is incredibly imperative. And I think there are a lot of organizations that have embraced this idea of employer-led training. And that's led to some significant results in organizations across the country. I think that approach, and I think what Andy talked about also, in making sure that all of the right players are at the table talking about this solution and informing what is the right program in a particular geography, I think allows us to have the best shot at making this work.
Plenio, do you have a favorite story of someone whose life you've turned around through Perscolas?
Yes, actually, let me share the story of Nicholas. Nicholas was a ramp agent at BWI Airport, lost his job in November as a result of the pandemic, and didn't know where to go next. Found a flyer on this organization called Perscolas, enrolled in the initiative in November, and graduated just a couple of months ago with 2 industry recognized certifications. And within 30 days of graduation, landed a job as a systems administrator for one of the major companies in Baltimore, earning 25% more than what he was in his previous job. There are so many stories like Nicholas's that we can share. Thousands of Americans across this country that are getting our training and getting jobs in the industry. It's truly a remarkable program, and the impact is significant.
Angie, I would love to get your response on this, and just tell me, if you have a favorite student in the retraining, workforce retraining arena.
Sure. So, I often think about kind of, if I had the magic wand, kind of what would we do? And I think this world of workforce development is sometimes complicated, right? Because there isn't a silver bullet. It's not just do this training. It's this combination of what will put individuals on a path to economic mobility and really kind of sustainability and choice-filled lives. It's this combination of work experience and some upskilling, having the right skills that will kind of future-proof their job prospects. And so I think that, I think a lot about things like data science for all, again, at any age, not just kind of an educational perspective, but I think about some programs that we had really right before the pandemic, but they've become really incredibly important now. Data analytics in healthcare and in public healthcare in particular. We work with our local public hospital system, and we were able to kind of create programs through LaGuardia Community College that really help to ensure that frontline healthcare workers that were pretty at the entry level were able to get data analytics training so that they could help in terms of social determinants of health, and really try to understand what is important about community healthcare and kind of how we can make it better. And so, in terms of a particular program about a particular student, I think about the cohorts of folks who go through these employer-led trainings where they really are being invested in by their employers. They can understand the bigger picture, they can understand the trajectory, and that feels incredibly important. I also think that, in addition to something like data analytics, which just feels like a really ubiquitous skill set that could be really required for everyone, I think it's important, you named it, that not every job is that first, kind of gateway job. We need to really think about our policies and our programs that not only train folks for that first job, but that are mid-career and that are really kind of focused on long-term jobs. And I think that a lot of training programs are funded to kind of do training and then get people into a job that really looks at a wage level. And I actually think that's just so simplistic in terms of people and trajectories and kind of what they want out of careers. And so those are some of the pieces that I think, Plinio and Andy and Nancy's remarks really sparked for me.
It's really, really important. I am kind of obsessed with this topic, and I want to just give Nancy the last word, because there's some dimensions, and Nancy and I have known each other a long time. And so one of the big issues for Nancy Lamont, if I can put it on the table, is the fragility of the economic circumstances, particularly of women, elder women, but of elder Americans. And so, when you're kind of looking, as you just said, they're scrambling to pay the bills, do this, we're talking about retraining. My experiences, and it may have changed, and we'll have to have a part 2 to this conversation down the road to find out. My experience is knowing someone who was laid off 4 times at a high-tech company, trained his successor from a foreign country, and then decided he couldn't take it anymore and wanted to go into healthcare. Now he's a much-loved nurse at a local elder care facility. But it cost him about $65,000 to pay for that, through which most of his family and friends helped him pay for this. So we talk about retraining. Per Scholas, I know, is free. I assume there are resources out there. But Nancy, as we talk about the economic fragility in this, I don't want to be cavalier. There are real costs for real people, even as we talk about the importance of transitioning. Am I wrong or am I right?
No, absolutely. And I think one of the factors in people's minds about getting retraining is, can I afford to make this investment? And if I can, am I going to get a job at the end of it? And I think the more we can partner, and I'm delighted by this conversation, with groups that can provide training at a reasonable cost and provide opportunities that may well materialize, we'll be in much better shape. AARP, in addition to our policy and our advocacy work, for 45 years has been one of the major implementers of the Department of Labor's Senior Community Service Employment Program. And so we have some firsthand knowledge of how do you train older workers. We have been working right before the pandemic. We were working on an agreement with a number of community colleges to include older students in their advanced manufacturing training programs. And I believe, to the point I think all 3 of my colleagues here have made, that the training has to be different than it's been kind of historically, and also very geographically and industry focused. And that's the key. And I couldn't agree more that we need to knit together all of these wonderful opportunities that you've described, that Brian described right before us, and move ahead. There is no question that older Americans need to be in the workforce. And if they aren't, it is a major, major issue for the economy and for poverty in this country.
Well, let's make a deal that I want to have a part 2 to this conversation. I want to talk about what's happening at the City University of New York, but digital platforms, digital education. I've been on with the Coursera's. I, secretly, sign on to some SalCons, do some calculus brush up, and all of these kinds of things are out there. And I'd love to kind of learn more about how we can, in this time of what we learned from the pandemic, reach people where they are, using compelling digital platforms and what we've learned to help give these people skills, whether they are in West Virginia or Montana or Mobile, Alabama. There are lots of folks out there that can be reached in new ways. So we'll leave this as a part 1 of a needed part 2 discussion. I want to thank Andy Van Clunen, CEO of National Skills Coalition, Pino Ayala, CEO and President Per Scholas, Angie Kamath, Dean for Continuing Education and Workforce Development at the City University of New York, Love Scooney, and Nancy Lamont, Executive Vice President, Chief Advocacy and Engagement Officer at AARP. Thank you all so much. Great conversation.
Thank you, Steve.
According to the World Economic Forum and their 2020 Future of Jobs report, the workplace is automating much faster than expected and is going to displace, get this, 85 million jobs in the next 5 years. At the same time, They project the robot revolution is going to create 97 million new jobs. That's theoretically a big net plus. Our next guest is Saadia Zahidi, the Managing Director of the World Economic Forum and the author of this annual report. Saadia, great to see you. Thank you so much for joining us. You know, I've been a participant in the World Economic Forum now for decades, and fascinated by the Fourth Industrial Revolution, fascinated by these changes. But, you know, part of this is not just jobs and job training. It's also about the social contract that people have with the workplace, with the government. And I'd just love to learn, as you kind of anticipate this future transition, how do we need to look at that social contract to help people get from A to B?
Dave, great to see you. Thank you for having me. I think there are many components to that social contract, but maybe let me just say another word or two on the trends that we're finding, and particularly for this conversation, I think maybe bringing sort of the global nature of those trends could be quite helpful. This is not a challenge in the United States alone. This is a concern around the world, but the nature of the social contract in different economies ends up determining how fast we solve for this challenge. So one quick word on what has happened recently. We had for some time, for a good 4 or 5 years, been tracking the trends from the Fourth Industrial Revolution and what automation was doing to the workplace. What has happened now is, of course, this double disruption. With the pandemic and the pandemic-induced recession, we're now seeing much faster acceleration of integration of technologies into the workplace. And at the same time, we are seeing a far, far less dynamic labor market than we've seen in the last decade. So those two things combined have made it absolutely imperative that this sort of reskilling revolution that all of your other panelists have been talking about actually happens, and that there needs to be a more direct focus and investment on job creation, particularly jobs of tomorrow. So what does that look like in terms of what needs to be done by different stakeholders? One element is that there is a business case for training. So we found that for 2 out of 3 employers, they can expect a return on investment from fairly basic reskilling within 1 year. And it is absolutely worth it for most employers to provide some of that reskilling and upskilling. And depending on where you are in the world, it usually is far cheaper to reskill and redeploy workers than to go down the route of layoffs. So that's one key piece. A second element is that there will need to be much greater public policy and perhaps a government intervention in the labor market to provide some of that reskilling and redeployment. There need to be the right kinds of networks, the job centers, the common skills, language, and taxonomies to make all of this work. And third, there needs to be some further reform of education and lifelong learning systems so that we're not trying to do this in a single shot and hoping that this one-time reskilling and upskilling will get us to this future, but actually we put in place the systems that are needed for doing this on a constant basis, because this acceleration of technology is here to stay.
Do you think, when you talk about the government's role, which interests me about what they have to do, you know, sometimes the government can do things but not do them as well as the private sector. I've always wondered, you know, given that we just had very interesting panel discussion on skills development, upskills, how to do it. And also, you know, you made the comment that it's in the interests of companies to do this. But does gravity alone get us there because it's in their interest? Or do we need to provide tax credits to those companies that do it? Because otherwise you may have companies that just free ride. I mean, I'm just interested in, you know, if you get the behavior that sort of improves the capital stock, the octane of capital, human capital in a nation, and certain contribute to that and others don't. Should we begin looking at, you know, tax benefits and whatnot to reward or at least incentivize those that are making those investments?
Great points. Let me try to unpack two things there. One piece is there's a business case for most companies individually, but it applies to 2/3. It does not apply to everybody. And so there may need to indeed be incentives provided by governments that support that other 1/3 that don't necessarily see a business case, that don't necessarily see those returns, but for whom, by changing the math, it might actually make sense and get the right kind of ROI so that they continue to invest in reskilling, upskilling, and redeployment of those workers rather than going for a different route. So that's one element.
Right.
The second piece there is on the government side. So I think this is where a lot of the stimulus packages, and obviously there's some good news around this in the United States, but in other parts of the world too, there needs to be now a clearer understanding that part of the stimulus efforts that are happening in most advanced and large emerging markets, they need to think also about reskilling as part of that investment. In fact, one report we did in collaboration with PwC found that, again, with the right kind of fairly minimal reskilling and upskilling investment, it would add about $6 trillion to global GDP by 2030, in addition to all of the societal returns in terms of better jobs, better education, better skills for people. So again, there is that double win for both society and broadly for the economies. For governments too, this makes a lot of sense, not just in terms of sort of tax credits and other incentives to business, but some direct and upfront investment.
Sadia, I've read Klaus Schwab. Klaus Schwab, for our audience, is the chairman and founder of the World Economic Forum. His book on the Fourth Industrial Revolution have been out to the center in the Bay Area in America. And a very quick shorthand definition of this for folks is really a coming age of automation, the Internet of Things, the connectedness of things. In part, we've been discussing some of this today. A world of 5G is not just your phone and download times, it's the connectivity of everything, major data passing, artificial intelligence, quantum computing. I'm interested in the degree to which, as you look at that coming world, and you may have called it the age of robots, and the number of jobs that'll be created, is, from your perspective, as you look, I don't know where you are in Switzerland or wherever you may be now, as you look at China, you look at Russia, you look at the United States, you look at India, which of these nations is most eagerly rushing into this and embracing that coming future and positioning their workforce well, and which are not? And do you worry about the United States not rushing as quickly as it ought into this world so that it can help its people get in front of this process rather than be victims of it?
A couple of elements there. I mean, the United States is one of the most globally competitive economies in the world and continues to maintain its position amongst the top few countries when it comes to broadly economic competitiveness measures. Getting into the details, though, of the types of technologies, that is where I would say it is a global trend across most large businesses and some of the largest advanced and emerging economies. When we survey companies, again, globally, over 80% are looking at the Internet of Things, are integrating cloud computing, are integrating big data analytics. And even for some of the more under development technologies, such as cloud computing, that's more than 30% of companies globally that are planning to integrate that technology. And the consequences are that not only is there a much more rapid incursion of machines into what were previously human tasks in traditional areas such as information and data processing, we know those are areas where machines and algorithms can take over. What's surprising is how much reasoning and decision making, how much coordinating and developing and managing and advising, and how much communicating and interacting, all the very human traits, how quickly those are being automated. And I think that's where we have to focus, because it means highlighting even more the human traits. And that is where the education systems and broadly the lifelong learning systems across these different economies that you mentioned are going to kind of make or break the future competitiveness. Competition will not necessarily come just from the integration of those technologies. It will come from developing the right human capital.
Sadia, we're out of time, but I want to ask one last question, because I know you've tweeted about it and you care about it, which is, the gender gap, the gender inequities that are out there, the racial inequities that are out in jobs and opportunity, that we're not yet at the point of the kind of inclusion and the rewards of that we should have. when I look at a moment we're going to make a strategic leap in the technology, it's also an opportunity to rewire things. So is there an opportunity built into this future, this fourth industrial revolution, this future age we're going into, to rewire ourselves so we can leapfrog out of the historic biases that we've had against some people and communities?
Let me share. I think the challenges are very clear. So we've all seen that this pandemic and the pandemic-induced recession has had perhaps a far more negative impact on women. It has obviously shown a very negative impact on minorities. A lot of our data shows that there's a lot more sort of stress and concern around the dual burden of care and of working for both minorities and for women. So the challenges are clear. What does exist here is an opportunity to leapfrog and change and to get to a wholly new reality. So let's take the gender example. One piece is, if we know that the frontline workers in this pandemic have been some of the most essential workers, such as teachers, such as people working in grocery stores, such as delivery workers, such as nurses, such as doctors, these all happen to be professions that actually employ a lot of women. In fact, depending on the economy you're in, they can be majority employing women. We need to revalue those roles. We need to think differently about wages. We need to think differently about the standards in those types of roles. And again, for most governments, these are massive job creators of the future. We just need to make them better paid and better skilled jobs. The second element is those high-tech jobs of tomorrow. So cloud computing, for now, the talent in cloud computing that is female, only 14%. We don't want the future of our workplaces and our technologies to be determined only by one minority group. And so the focus should be on trying to get to gender parity, trying to ensure it's much more representative. And that, of course, leads to better business as well. So there is an opportunity here. But again, it's going to take very proactive groups. We cannot, or proactive efforts and policies. We cannot rely on inertia alone to get us there.
Well, Saadia Zahidi, I really enjoyed this conversation. So insightful, and I really appreciate you being very blunt about the trade-offs that we have to look at. Managing Director of the World Economic Forum, I hope you'll come back. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
As the world continues to rely more and more on automation, innovation, and digital services and technology, how do we ensure the security and stability of these systems and the protection of intellectual property? I'm joined now by someone who spends a lot of his time pondering this very question. He's a very rare kind of creature, if I may say. This is my own editorial. Keith Krach is the former Undersecretary of State for Economic Growth, Energy, and the Environment. That means he was a government official tasked with, thinking about economic issues. But he was also the former CEO of DocuSign, a hugely successful tech company, and has launched many, many other businesses. I mean, Keith, I would say it's a real pleasure to talk to you. I've known about you for years, but I also know that, jumping from one of these sides to the other is not something you often see. And so as we think about, when I first thought about having you in here, the first thing that came to mind was not just jobs of the future. I mean, part of this discussion today is about trust, right? It's about social trust, what your social network is. It's what the American government and the private sector can do to kind of create the right environment. And it's also about global competition, both the opportunities and risks. So I would love you to share with our audience, as you look at this as a CEO, as an investor, and as a former government official, what equities do we have to get right to make sure that the future of jobs in this country are, that story is a good story?
Well, Steve, first of all, thanks so much for having me as part of the event. Job creation has been near and dear to my heart. And maybe I am a strange creature. I grew up in small town Ohio. My dad had a 5-person machine shop in the good times, and it was just me and him in the tough times. I could weld at the age of 12, and I've been blessed to have the good fortune of the American dream. So, growing up in the Midwest, it was all about a work ethic. And I think one of the big things that is really important, has been a big focus of my professional career, is driving productivity, because what that does is it increase the standard of living. And as my dad said, the American dream is when the student passes the professor. In other words, that I have more opportunities than he did, and my children have more opportunities than I did.
Right.
And so this whole area of retraining the workforce in terms of automation, all these kind of things in the tech business. And I've been able to build some great companies, industry leader, industrial robotics, mechanical software, B2B e-commerce, obviously DocuSign, and then to get a chance to do it from the government side, where we onboarded, for example, onshored, and I think the revitalization of semiconductors, which is absolutely critical to this country's national security.
One of the issues we haven't really touched much on today, but I always think about it when we're thinking about technology. It can be liberalizing. It also can be restricting. You can have opportunities of connectivity, and you can have consequences of that. My friend Brad Smith, who is the president of Microsoft, wrote a great book called Tools and Weapons. And he kind of looked at things like facial recognition software and said, that could be very helpful in many ways, to friends and police enforcement. It can be a real drag in China in your social capital score. I'd love to get, a quick snapshot from you about some of those trade-offs as we think about technology. Sure. Do we need to be thinking through risks as well as opportunities? And as we are creating a kind of globally competitive issue where we're looking at jobs in this country and where we're going, how do we get that dimension of it right and still remain globally competitive?
By the way, it's really a great question. And, anything that can be automated will be. I mean, history's just proven that. And I think this gets back to your original comments about trust. Because to me, trust is the most important word in any language. You partner with people you trust, you buy from people you trust, you do business with people you trust, you vote for people that you trust. So these trust principles, when it comes to the use of technology, it's absolutely critical. And that is things like transparency, reciprocity, data privacy, security, all these things. And this is so much the question of our time. This not only takes, it requires all three branches of our government, but it also requires our private sector involvement. I say that to my fellow brethren out there in Silicon Valley, as well as our allies. And, obviously in the government, a big focus of mine was creating a global economic security strategy that drives economic growth, drives jobs, but also maximizes national security and also combats economic aggression. And so when you talk the issue about China, where they built a one-way, I call it the great one-way China firewall, where all the data comes in, but none goes out, and all the propaganda goes out, but the truth does not come in. This is a big issue. And this is critical in terms of the economic battlefield of technology. Because if you look at what the Chinese Communist Party does, it's a surveillance state. And they use that for things like genocide in Xinjiang, a punishable genocide. So, yeah. And by the way, when you look at, for example, Huawei, where the clean network that we developed is the first government-led initiative that actually defeated China Inc. These are tools that the worst of dictators could have dreamed of.
Thank you for that, Keith. One of the things I find fascinating about this time, this last, it's been a blur the last year and 3 months, whatever, on living online. We used to talk about going from analog to digital. We really now have, we are now walking the walk. Before we were just talking about it, I think. And, we've seen, lives changed and improved, more nimble relations with the employer and working at home. Lots of other things we've learned that we didn't know we could do before. At the same time, I don't want to inflate this, but I get about a letter a month from previous employers or places I had credit cards about information I had that they had about me that was hacked. And giving me a free subscription to some identity monitoring service. I must have about 10 of them now. Is there a point from your knowledge of this industry, where we're at, both government, whatever, where we're going to be able to leapfrog out of security fragility and into security strength in the IT world, in the 5G world that we're going into?
It's always a moving target. And this is such a critical issue. If you ask any corporate CEO, what keeps you up at night? The answer will always be that they're going to get hacked. And there's never a min on your pillow at the end of the night and say, okay, you solved that problem. You've always got to be aware of it. And you're absolutely right. What the pandemic did is it changed forever how we work, learn, and play. And that's a fact. You can see it in your children. I've got 5 kids. These guys are doing phenomenal things online. You can see it, in work. You can see it just in every perspective. And that privacy is really, really something that's really important. And you've got to make sure that there's forces for good. Here's this guy from small town Ohio, number 3 on China's sanction list. What greater honor could I have? If I got a certificate, I'd sleep with it under my pillow at night, because it means we got results in terms of combating that and defeating China Inc.'s master plan to control 5G communications. And I think you were talking about right before I came on that 5G is more than just a smartphone. Yeah. This is utility grids, power systems, sanitation systems, Internet of Things, manufacturing process. And that's a national security.
Well, this is not name dropping, but I had dinner the other night with Senator Joe Manchin and his wife Gail Manchin, who is, was co-chair of the International Commission on Religious Freedom, and she is also on that China sanctions list. We ought to get all of you together, to a dinner one night, and you can share stories about being on that China sanctions list.
It'd be a sanction party. What could be funner? You have nothing to lose.
Well, Keith Kroc.
And by the way, I'll tell you, today my successor, Jose Fernandez, just had his Senate confirmation hearing. He did a great job. And it was really great to hear him tell Chairman Menendez, about the great progress that we've made in 5G with the clean network and on that technology front. And I really think there's great continuity in policy in that. And I'm really bullish on the Biden administration continuing this alliance of democracies and based on these democratic values, based on these trust principles, and leveraging the innovation and resources of the private sector. At the end of the day, I think that's going to be key for our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren.
Well, Keith Kroc, former CEO of Ariba, former CEO of DocuSign, former Undersecretary of State for Economic Growth, Energy, and the Environment. Cool job. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Steve. All the best.
Well, we know a great number of small businesses had a very difficult time during COVID. Some entrepreneurs, and I'm going to come back to that word in a moment because we overuse that word, but these entrepreneurs found this is the right time to start a new venture. We're joined now by Jim McKelvey, a serial entrepreneur, co-founder of Square and the author of The Innovation Stack, Building an Unbeatable Business One Crazy Idea at a Time. Go buy this book, folks, because I have to tell you, and I don't often say that about many things, I'm obsessed with the book. The stories are kind of, funky, and it plays with your head. And Jim, I just want to say it's great to see you. I wanted to have this discussion because, you make the point in the book that we overuse the word entrepreneurs, that entrepreneurs are usually, that man or woman that's charging off the field the wrong direction when everybody else going the other way, or they're obsessively, compulsively, tied into one thing and no one's paying attention. And they're solving problems. And I've used your book today as a frame to discuss many of these issues. Cities trying to solve problems, one after another, one after another, one after another. Because the methodology you talk about, which I'd love you to elucidate a little bit, is one that I think we've become careless about. And would love to get your thoughts about how the innovation stack, or this kind of problem solving as we get into to fix things within the coming way of text, and thinking about human people and jobs and how they fit in there. Please help us have a new frame that I think is very important.
Yeah, so when I started to write the book, I realized that I didn't have the word that I needed in the English language. which was a word to describe people in business who weren't doing what everybody else was doing. And it turns out that was the original definition of the word entrepreneur. And when I discovered that, I was like, oh my God, 150 years ago, they had the same problem, which was they needed a way to separate all the people who were doing, sort of normal, rational businesses, like, opening up coffee shops and opening up accounting firms and, doing construction and, laying asphalt from this group who were doing things that were totally new. And so the original meaning of the word entrepreneur was somebody who was doing something totally new. And it's a different set of rules, Steve. Like, what happens when you're doing something totally new, at a fundamental level, you don't get the security of copying something else that is very similar that works. So you just don't want to be the first person in the in the test group, right? But if you're an entrepreneur in the classic sense, you're going to have to be. In other words, you're going to have to do something for which there is no known solution. And the world of rules that you can confront in that situation is totally different. And so when I wrote the book, what I was trying to do was section off this world that I spent a lot of time in, where I didn't know what I was doing. Nobody else knew what I was doing. There were no experts or consultants or degrees or any sort of comfort in knowing that the direction that my team and I were pursuing was correct. And so that's what the innovation stack is all about. And the title came just from this interesting sort of coincidence that I noticed, because I started studying companies throughout history, and I noticed that there was this group of companies who, because they couldn't copy what was done previously for various reasons, ended up all doing the same thing, building these things that were called innovation stacks, and they ended up dominating their industries. So I just thought this was super interesting and actually sort of super encouraging, because if you think about the world of the entrepreneur, when you're actually the first person doing something, it's also the world where nobody can be an expert. In other words, we're all qualified, or I should say, we're all equally unqualified to do something new.
No, I mean, this is the great thing, Jim. I've always respected you, and we've known each other for a long time, but I didn't know how unqualified you were to be doing what you were doing until I read the book. And it was just one of these really interesting things. I'll just tell our audience that Jim was a glassblower, got in this issue, realized it was hard for small businesses, not only small businesses, but just people to sell their talents to folks, in credit card land, or to do global transactions, or to do anything, that they were cut out of the system. Tens of millions, scores of millions of people were cut out of the system. And so you violated the law. I mean, I don't want to get into all the book, but I mean, you basically created, with Jack Dorsey, who worked for you, you gave him his first job really in it, like at one level, and we won't go into that, but later you guys teamed up and did this. And Amazon came out to kill you. Amazon came in to trounce you, and they couldn't do it. And that's part of the story. Then you found lots of patterns of that happening before. And Amazon on Halloween, just to give you the tension, folks out there, sent all of its clients, when Amazon waved the white flag, it sent all of its clients the square to use on their phones so that they could do charges. So it's an incredible story, but it's more than just kind of a boutique story. It's about a pattern of how you beat this mammoth company that was trying to kill you.
Yeah, I mean, if it had just been Square, it would not have been interesting as a book. What happened to my company when Amazon attacked us, we fully expected to die. I mean, because up until that point, when Amazon attacked the startup always lost. It was 100% true. And Square was the first company to survive a direct attack by Amazon as a startup. And I was amazed. And when it was all over and Amazon had relented, I then was bothered by the fact that I thought, well, this is so weird. I wonder if it's ever happened to anybody else. And so what I did was I started looking through history. And sure enough, if you sort of leave the tech world and are willing to look throughout different industries and throughout different times and different countries, you'll see a lot of the same things happen, which is these entrepreneurs, these innovative companies that build these innovation stacks often get attacked, sometimes by competitors, sometimes by governments. But there's usually this vicious battle And this tiny little thing that you wouldn't imagine survives, and then it thrives and it grows. And that's, in fact, what's happened at Square, but it's also happened at hundreds of other companies. And this is such an interesting pattern because, you know, as somebody who's lived through it, I saw it from the inside, but then to actually sort of study it academically was super interesting. And it's actually, I think, a pretty positive message. So I was happy to share that with the world.
I want to, ask you kind of a cosmic question, because I don't remember the name of the company that preceded this that you built, but it was my understanding you basically took, trade show stuff and put it on CD-ROMs, and it's an early industry, and you were trying to fix some problems. This young, Marsh's son, guy named Jack, came to work for you. You ignored him for 40 minutes. Ends up it's Jack Dorsey as a teenager, and he did some all-nighters with you. But the point is, Jack may have been innately ape-capable in certain ways, but what you get from your little small operations that turned out to be really well was a willingness to be unconventional, a willingness to take risks. And a lot of our conversation today has been talking about classic and conventional jobs, jobs that are paid for. But I'm just interested in also talking about surfing opportunities, taking risks, which I know, not everyone can do. But, the stories that I'm looking at where you basically had no money, putting things in there, crazy ideas. Have you ever thought about, because I've talked about you today, you've also given people mid-career who've had health problems, who've gone out and been badly trained at their local, St. Louis community college and helped turn them into world-class coders. But as you, trying to look at this thing of how to give people the wherewithal and the confidence to take risks, as opposed to pursuing jobs and livelihood more conventionally.
Well, so I think one of the things that I always preach is that it's not a hero story. And one of the things that I think we get taught is that these people who are super successful or, somehow have done amazing things are somehow different than we are. He was a genius, or she was gifted, or they have this incredible work ethic, or, there's some sort of superlative that differentiates that person from us. And I think the media tends to portray these people, in sort of glowing terms because that kind of sells product. But these hero stories do a really bad thing because they make us feel like we're not capable of doing it. And what I found in my research was that, quite the opposite was the case, which is that the people who were the heroes of these stories, the people who built these, mega successful businesses and, dominated industries, were all pretty normal, flawed human beings. I'll put myself in that category. And we were all able to succeed because we got a hold of a very, very powerful set of tools. And it wasn't that we were superheroes. It was, or I guess if we were superheroes sort of like Batman is. Batman doesn't have any, sort of superpowers. He just got a lot of really cool stuff, So if you want to be a superhero, it's possible to be Batman. It's not possible for bullets to bounce off your chest.
Well, Jim McKelvey, serial entrepreneur, co-founder of Square, author of one of the best books that I've read this past year, Innovation Stack, Building an Unbeatable Business, One Crazy Idea at a Time. I love the stories. I love your writing style as well. It's very irreverent. And you help me understand Elon Musk is just like any other person. So, Jim McKelvey, thank you so much for joining us. I hope you'll come back because I want to continue this conversation.
Anytime. Thank you, Steve.
As we discussed earlier, some industries experience a displacement of jobs as a result of increased automation. But in sectors like telehealth, big deal telehealth, particularly in rural areas, technology is making it easier to hire, among others, critical care specialists. Our next guest is Deanna Larson, CEO of Avera eCare, one of South Dakota's leading telehealth providers. Avera eCare has 6 healthcare service lines that service more than 420 locations in 32 states. They are huge. Deanna, it's great to meet you and to talk about it. I mean, we were talking a little bit earlier about how the pandemic kind of made us be more real about living on digital platforms. A lot of people talked about it before, but a big chunk of the country was not there. Now we're all there, and particularly in things we need like health. How has that ecosystem evolved and developed this past year from your perspective? Tell us the Avera story.
Oh, I'm delighted to be here and share the story with you. So the big story really is there's 2 parts of this, maybe 3, but the first 2 are the most important. So our providers were really enabled and had very little choice if they wanted to be in connection with their patients. And the consumers or the patients had very little choice if they wanted to be in connection with their doctors. And so the telehealth platforms were made available. There was access available to the physicians getting back to their patients and vice versa. So what all of a sudden happened is the brick and mortar were closed down. People who maybe questioned or wondered, would this really work for me? All of a sudden, that was the best access source. It was the safest. It provided confidentiality. And so between those two things, they were able to talk with their physicians and our nursing staff, ask questions. And we're really able to be connected in a very easy way, even easier than going to the brick and mortar and even easier than being unnecessarily exposed. So it was a really quick turnaround if you think about what was consuming, the whole nation just that many months ago.
I mean, we were just discussing a moment ago with Keith Kroc, the importance of trust, and as we develop these new systems, and in part regulation is out there to protect the public, but there's a balance with innovation and trying to do it. Are we getting it right between the regulatory side of health and doctors connecting, healthcare providers connecting online through providers like yourself? Is that about right, or do you find the government a bit slow?
That's a tough question. There's
it's what I do.
Every day you hear the hacking story, right?
Yeah.
Someone was hacked into, someone's identity was lost because of a hacking situation. So it's very long been the healthcare community's requirement to keep the confidentiality of patients' information. And so I do believe it's very important that we have the regulatory process so that patients' information can be safe and secure. They have the confidentiality they need to have the right discussions with their clinicians. And I also think it's very important that we push, the process consistent so that patients don't necessarily get exposed to maybe imposters as a physician imposter trying to say that they're a clinician, physician, and make themselves available, and patients are seeing someone who's not a physician. So I have a high regard and respect for that regulatory process. Do I think we could go faster and make those things happen? If you knew me at all, you would know I always want to push the metal, the pedal to the metal to make it go faster.
Oh, that sounds cool. I'm all with you on that. Deanna, let me ask you another question. We've also talked this past year a lot about how COVID disproportionately impacted certain communities and about realities in healthcare in the country that are uneven, particularly with Black and brown communities and different parts, the rural-urban divide, et cetera. Are there ways that we can leapfrog some of those problems and really solve some of that imbalance if we were to embrace your industry more than we have thus far?
Oh, I absolutely think, access is a real issue. So access, because you can't drive across a country, so to speak, in our rural geography, or access because you can't leave home as a young mother with several babies or individuals you're required to take care of. So access is always an issue, and it doesn't really matter where you live. And then the next really big issue is, do I have access to bandwidth or connectivity that's going to get me to the right level provider that I can trust? And so, FCC funding and some of those really important assets around bandwidth, and, Elon Musk putting the satellite opportunity in space for us for connectivity. Those are huge things that are going to be important across the nation and the world, really, for continued access and, again, high quality access.
You've become so big. I mean, you're the world's largest thing of this. You're like a conglomerate now. Different dimensions of the healthcare space. But one of them that I'm interested in is the Avera eCare Center. That's like a virtual hospital. So you have doctors, you have nurses, you have pharmacists, you have other healthcare doing this. Does this begin to replace brick and mortar? Does it supplement brick and mortar? I'm just sort of interested in the notion, is this the future that we're going to move into, where hospitals are virtual per se, because so much is, not I'm just interested in this dynamic. I want to visit. I don't even like going to a brick and mortar doctor. I'd love to just do it online.
Mm-hmm. let's start at the beginning of the problem. There's too many patients that outnumber the amount of providers, and especially the more specialty you get. So if you get at the highest level of subspecialty, there's not enough of them, and our trajectory is indicating there's going to be fewer available to that population. So it's so important to think about augmenting those clinicians. So we have these brilliant individuals in this industry of healthcare who go and get their education, and I think that telehealth, what it does is it augments the opportunity for those highly educated, and this, I could be talking about an RN, or I could be talking about a subspecialist peds rheumatologist, making sure that those individuals have access to patients who need them, because the workforce shortage is real. The need for healthcare and the cost of healthcare is real. So how do we augment workforce multiply through telemedicine to provide that important access where we can do that without brick and mortar? Do I think it'll replace brick and mortar? Never. Do I think it will augment and support easier access to healthcare than asking early questions about what's going on with you or your child? Do I need to see you now? Should I wait and come later? And if I do need to come in, where's the best access point? Do I go to the ED? Do I go to a primary care provider? Do I go right to a specialist because my need is so urgent? Those kinds of things I think consumers want all the time. And if you think about it, oftentimes we have a consumer who's all of a sudden shows up at maybe an infectious disease doctor, and they're saying, oh, gee, you should have went to rheumatology or urology, and a lot of time is lost in the process there. So how do we really help navigate? Can that be done on telemedicine, telephone, and really reduce the cost by not sending people all over, if you will, to a lot of brick and mortar? I really think it simplifies the consumer's life. It simplifies the healthcare profession's life as well, because they want to see the patients whom they can best help. In Sioux Falls, we do have all of those things I just said. I had nurses, pharmacists, boarded ED physicians, critical care intensivists, hospital medicine. But they are working in collegiality with those 400 some communities you mentioned. They aren't providing all of the care. They're working in an augmented style. So in maybe a rural community, we have a nurse practitioner who's supporting the overnight care in the emergency department, while the local community physician is not required to be in that hospital. Our boarded ED doc is, there at the touch of a button to support the care that's being provided there, and it gives the opportunity for us to call in the local provider if that's what's needed, or to not call them in, being reminded that that local provider is more than likely a primary care provider working all day in the clinic, working all day taking care of hospitalized patients, and then trying to go home, and yet still being required to be available on night, 24/7 emergency call. Now, it's not that they aren't capable of taking care of the majority of emergency, visits that come in, but just take into consideration, they're also then the highest level individual in the community to take care of car crashes, heart attacks, strokes, those things. Where again, if you were in a more urban setting, the boarded ED doc, who that's what they do every day, would have the support of a neurologist, a stroke neurologist, a cardiologist, etc. So what we're doing in that small community hospital is supporting the nurse practitioner while they're waiting. If needed, the local provider will come in. We've already brought in the stroke neurologist or the cardiologist to determine if this is a truly an MI, and actually even maybe supported the air transport to get to that small community hospital, getting that patient very quickly to a cath lab. On the other hand, let's say our boarded ED doc works with that nurse practitioner and says, well, I think this is something that you can work with locally here and stabilize, and we'll be here to support you and help you out. In that case, the physician who's home for the evening may not have to come into the hospital till the next morning, and would work in a collaborative style with the ED doc here in Sioux Falls, or the hospital medicine physician who's just a row away from them, who will then accept that patient and help admit and support that patient or in the overnight hospital setting. So you see what we just did. We just workforce augmented or workforce multiplied very capable and high-level individuals to support the care of that individual patient.
Well, Deanna, you've just accomplished something that I think was not possible. You made me very instantly comfortable with the notion of e-care. You know, like when you kind of like think about all the different, I mean, for me it's efficient, but I don't know if it's going to feel as comprehensive. And there are a lot of things that I don't know. You address the literacy issues. A lot of people going to this may not know which choices to make. They waste time. It's more than inefficient. It's that the system can't count on the patient knowing everything, and you just described that. I really, really appreciate the journey that you took us through. I hope you'll have us back, and then or you'll join us again, and I can go on an e-tour through many of the other divisions. But Deanna Larson, CEO of Avera eCare, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much. You're welcome to visit anytime.
Absolutely. Well, that brings us to the end of our program today. What a great set of conversations. A big thank you to Nokia for its support of this program, and to all of you in the audience for joining us. For any of you who missed these conversations, we're going to have them up on our video on our website shortly. I'm Steve Clements. Be well.